welcome. Today I'm talking to the Reverend Joseph Ola. Joseph's Amazon biography describes him as a writer, a blogger, a youth mentor, a podcast host, and minister. And since entering the ministry in 2012, he served churches and ministries in Nigeria, the United States, and the UK. He holds 2 master's degrees, one in biblical and pastoral theology, and another in African Christianity from Liverpool Hope University. He's an alumnus of the London Pioneer School with CMS Oxford, and he holds a certificate in pastoral ministry from Life Church College, Bradford, a BA in microbiology from a university in Nigeria, and he founded a live mentorship group in 2015, which is an online mentoring platform for teenagers and young adults, and has a growing global outreach to thousands of young people. In addition to all that, in his spare time, he is the pastor of Apostolic Church, Liverpool. Joseph, welcome. I don't know how you managed to fit all of that in and still stay so young.
I know, right? I think of it sometimes like, how many things am I doing? But yeah, it's a privilege and a honor, Hedy, to have this conversation with you. And yeah, I look forward to having a nice time together.
Yeah, well, I first came across you in a Missio Africanus theological roundtable presentation you gave on your research into young people and African Christianity. And that's what I'd like to talk about. I'll give a link to Missio Africanus in the notes for this. But before we get into that, could you just tell us a bit about yourself, your background, your family?
All right. In addition to all the things that you said before, I was born in Nigeria, in an ancient city called Ile-Ife in southwestern Nigeria. That's the city where all Yoruba is one of the major ethnic tribes in Nigeria. That's where all Yorubas are supposed to have originated from historically. I lived there till my young adult life, schooled up till my first degree there. I was born into a Christian home. My parents are church leaders in their own rights. And both of them are retired educators. My dad retired as a college principal, and my mom retired as a primary school ed teacher. So I grew up in that kind of family setting where education was like forefront. My parents were very intentional about giving us good education, but at the same time handing down over to us the Christian faith that they've so much cherished. And that has kind of shaped my journey up until this moment, literally. After my first degree in 2010, there is this compulsory 1-year service that we do in Nigeria. Every person after graduation, you are supposed to serve the nation for 1 year. I served in the northern part of the country at that period, and I was beginning to ask God, what do you want to do with my life going forward? And it was clear to me afterwards that I should go into pastoral ministry, and that's why I found myself in pastoral ministry as far back as 2012. Or as recently as 2012, depending on who is listening. And
yes, for me, that's quite recent.
And yeah, since then till now, it's been a very exciting journey from doing that to coming to the UK in 2015 for a Bible college and staying on to help a church plant till now. So yeah, that's much about me. I'm married and I have 2 boys with my wife. And yeah, we are enjoying life together. That's pretty much me in a nutshell.
How old are the boys?
The oldest is 4, but will be 5 in May, and the youngest is 2, but will be 3 in May. Both of them were born in May, just a few days apart.
Okay, so both still at home.
Yeah, both. There's one in the reception, but the other is still yeah. Well, it starts year 1 officially in September. So
one thing that we didn't talk about beforehand was that I'm quite excited that you have a background in biology, because I do too. I was a biologist before going to Bible college and then working in Bible translation.
That's interesting. I love my foundation in microbiology. I mean, I can't say that I still remember all the things I learned or how thought, but I look back to those years and I still treasure them. Absolutely.
Yeah. And it gives you a continuing fascination and pleasure in God's creation, I find.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Anyway, not your first degree or even your second, your third degree was at Liverpool Hope University. And
Yeah.
you did some research related to the way that millennial African Christians identify themselves. Could you just explain what that is? Well, what is a millennial, first of all, and then how do millennial African Christians consider themselves?
That's an interesting question. Of course, there is no unified or universally accepted definition of what a millennial is. From many American writers, they would define a millennial as someone that is born between 1980 and 2000. If you were born any time within that 20-year gap, you're supposedly a millennial. But really, the way I use the word in my research, it's more fluid than that. I've had to take allowance to include some people that were born in the early 21st century, so even up until like 2004-ish.
Okay.
I use an age range of 18 to 35, so some teenagers, some 20-somethings, and some 30-somethings, to capture that generation, for which I'm part of that generation as well anyways, that are more or less just referred to as young people in Africa today.
Yeah.
Which, as we've been hearing since I was young, are the future of tomorrow. That's kind of the definition that I worked with in doing the research, yeah.
And was your research amongst people in Africa or amongst the diaspora?
Yes, I involved both. Actually, I had to zero in on the Nigerian millennial Christians, if you will. But of course, using that as a sort of a representative case study for all of Africa. We know that, of course, there's so much diversity in the whole continent to kind of use just one minute case study to represent the whole. But there is yet lots of transferable realities, I believe, in my findings and in the realities on the Nigerian continent that is also shared in very many places around Africa. So yeah, I looked at Nigerian millennial Christians, but both those that are in the country now and those in the diaspora together, yeah.
Yes, I think that's one of the things that people in the UK don't always grasp, is just how diverse Africa is. 50 odd countries, but also Nigeria is the biggest country in sub-Saharan Africa by a long way. So you chose a good sample.
Thank you.
Could you share some of the key results from your study? What were the things you discovered?
Okay, to set out, the question I was really asking in this research was more or less, how do young Christians of Nigerian heritage, how do they self-identify in light of Christian faith and their cultural heritage? And I wanted to know the implications of that identity question, so to speak. And lots of things kind of shaped that overlapping realities, both in my own life and in my journey in ministry, that got me interested in that. I'm just laying that premise to before going into the findings. Part of the things I've been engaged with, I've actually been ministering to young, and when I say I'm ministering to young people, it's like ministering to my peers because I'm a young person myself. I've been involved in that kind of ministry since 2005, when I gained admission into Obafemi Ola University for my first degree. Throughout the years that I was doing that, I was also involved in the Christian fellowship in the university and saddled with various responsibilities at different. In my final year, I was literally pastoring the fellowship, and this is a fellowship of over 400 students, and I was just 19 years old. So as of that time, I'd been involved with doing things with young people. And then in 2015, I felt the lead in to actually be more intentional into pouring into just a few handful teenagers in my congregation in Lagos, Nigeria at the time. And I thought the best way I thought I could do that then was to create a WhatsApp group, gather all of them together and continue to reach out to them. But before I knew it, they were telling me, I have a friend that is interested in some of the things you are sharing with us. Can I bring him in? Can I bring her in? And that's how the community began to grow. And today it's over 3,000, a 3,000 member community.
Wow.
In my interaction with all of these young people over the years and my own personal reflection on my journey, becoming a parent in a foreign land, raising boys and all of that, I've had to ask myself a lot of questions. And my study in African Christianity actually then brought that front and center for me to begin to wrestle with some of those things, giving me the lens to see some things through and the language to articulate some of these things. Hence the research question. As per my findings, the major realities that came from the research is how, to a very great extent, the cultural sense of our identity as African young people, if you will, we are losing touch of that. In fact, the younger the age, the higher the tendency that they will be out of touch with their cultural heritage and identity. Yeah. For those of us that are still like what I would call older millennials, those 31 to 35-year-olds currently, there is still a good grasp on some of these cultural identity markers, things like language. How fluent are you in your mother tongue, in speaking and understanding your mother tongue? When I ask questions like that in my research, I would see that those that are older would still say they are fluent in it. But then when you go down to the 18s to 20s and 23s, you find out that the percentage of those that are not able to speak their indigenous language fluently is much higher. Things like how conversant are you with like proverbs, which is again a core cultural identity marker for many African ethnicities. You find the same reality. And when I then look at those in the diaspora, the challenge is even higher. And so it's those that have been in the diaspora for a long time or were even born there, they find it more challenging to, for instance, be fluent in their indigenous language and things like that. And so that's one of the major findings, if you will. Of course, there are many other questions that I was asking in the research to kind of unpack why that is so, or what is underlying those realities. So for instance, I was also interested in finding out what factors were influencing their Christian faith most. And for that particular question, for instance, it's the parents were the most influential factor. So, but next to that, I would have expected to see like the pastor of my church, but that did not come until like 4th or 5th place. Next to parents are people that they are doing life together in their fellowships, in their Christian communities. And next to that are what they call Christian mentors, like someone that is discipling them or the role of a mentor in their life. Before we then begin to find things like their congregational pastor and things like that. So that's another finding for me that was like, oh, okay, could there be that there's a flag there as to what churches are that would make it in a way that even their pastors don't command as much influence in their life as, say, a mentor that they might not even exactly have had a physical contact with, or people that they are just doing life together in a setting which is more or less exclusively just young people leading, doing life with fellow young people, if you will. So that was another kind of key finding. But I think the most, I mean, this is relative, but one of the most outstanding findings for me is the influence of Western thoughts in the faith development of these young people. One of the questions I asked, for instance, had to do with the kind of books they are reading. You know, what are your, like, what's the most influential book, like Christian book that you've read? And the top 12 books, except for one, were all written by Westerners.
Whoa.
All of the way the questionnaire was constructed is such that when someone responds and adds some names to that list or some titles to that list, the next person coming to respond can see those titles as options and then still add more if he or she feels like from other books that I want to add to this list. And so it's a self-developing kind of questionnaire. But at the end of the day, it was clear that the Westerners were dominating, if I could use that word, the influence space for these young people in terms of books, in terms of even movies that they're watching, in terms of podcasts that they are listening to. And those are the major sources of cultural shapers, culture shapers in my own understanding for a young person. The kind of multimedia sources that are getting information across to them. And that space is heavily dominated by Western thoughts. It's one of the other findings that I found like a major finding in the research. And there are so many other sub-layers of all these things that I could point to, but those would be some of the major key findings from it.
That's fascinating. I wonder if we could just unpack some of those a little. Just with a rising generation who are, to some extent, not identifying as strongly as African, what do you see the implications of this are for the future of the church?
That's, the implications are myriad, to be honest, but let's start from 2 or 3 realities about the African continent now that then gives us a light into what these implications could look like. First, the fact that Africa is now the most Christian continent in the sense of the population of Christians. There are more Christians in Africa than anywhere else in the world as of today. And that's not even factoring in the African diaspora. And then, of course, the median age of Africa as a continent has been below 20 for over 70 years. Those 2 realities in and of itself continue to point to, on the one hand, how religion, or I mean, in this case, Christianity, would continue to be very, very significant on that space. And of course, from there to the rest of the world. And then the place of the young people in that, by virtue of how many young people are on the continent. Those that are, I mean, over 70% of African population are people that are less than 30 years old. So that's a huge, it shows a huge trajectory for the future as to what's potential locked up in this kind of findings, especially as per this research. And so in terms of implications, 2 things. I see a good news, bad news scenario in my findings, if I could summarize the findings. The good news is the fact that there is still a lot of interest in religion, in Christianity, in this case, amongst the millennials or the Christian, I mean, the young people in Africa, as compared to, say, in the West, where there is this huge intentional, almost intentional disdain, or not just want to have anything to do with religion. So that's the good news. But the bad news then is the fact that it's obvious that the cultural part of what it means to be an African and a Christian at the same time, that's been eroded. So I think from my findings, it's obvious that those that are older, the older millennials, the 31 and above, they stand a higher chance of kind of ameliorating that trend if they will be intentional in mentoring the next generation coming after them, if they will be intentional in resourcing themselves with the kind of resources that could help them further to hone their cultural identity and heritage, and allow that to shape the way they do Christianity, and then, of course, hand that over, and then, of course, influence how they parent their own children that are coming, raising or coming after them. So there is that aspect of the implication. But by and large, to the mission of God in the world, think that the continent of Africa, given this trajectory of continuous influx or growth of Christianity and Christian population on the continent, and the young people being a significant part of that, we hold a strategic place in influencing global Christianity.
Absolutely.
But for that to be what it should be, for that to give all of the full colors of the beauty of this multicultural mosaic of God, so to speak, as per God's kingdom, it will be dependent on if those that are African Christians can actually make an African contribution to the mission of God, as opposed to just replicating what they've learned from some Western, from elsewhere. And so that's where I think the church has a lot of work to do. There would be the need for an intergenerational ministry model that bring in these young people into leadership as quickly as possible under the oversight of the older generation, but so that we can rub minds on off of one another and together how to make this uniquely African contribution to the mission of rather than being just a resounding board for something from somewhere else. In that sense, I think those would be some of the things I would naturally point to as the implications.
Another thing that you mentioned was that the younger young people are less likely to speak their mother tongue, the language of their family. Now, I work for a Bible translation organization, and I hear that, and it does worry me slightly. What do you think are the implications for people like me who are working specifically in African languages?
On the one hand, I think that one of the major things that led to this point is the way the generation of, say, my own parents kind of celebrated any of their children that can, gain mastery of the English language and even earlier in life, to the point where when my generation are becoming parents, it's become a norm to almost raise a family exclusively on the English language. That's of Nigeria, an Anglophone country. I would imagine the same is happening in some of the Francophone countries.
Yes, it does,
French being the lingua franca, so to speak. And so because of that, for Bible translation, and first and foremost, let me just celebrate the work you're doing.
Thank you.
I believe that for theology, in this case, African theology to happen, in my opinion, African theology happens when African orality and the scriptures in indigenous language come together. The African worldview is big on orality, on how we use words, speeches and things like that. And when we can get the scriptures in our indigenous language and using the tools of our orality with that, miracle happens in the world of theology. And that's why many of the theologians, as it were, on the continent today are not even necessarily academic theologians, but
absolutely
taking what they found from God's word, articulating that in their indigenous ways, in songs, in music, in art, in movies, and all of that. And so, for a Bible translation organization, I would think of two things. The first would be to continue to translate into as many indigenous languages as possible. There are still many languages in Africa today that are yet to have the scriptures in their language. So we need more of that. Give us more theological raw materials to theologize with. But on the other hand, would then also be the accessibility of those translations. I was joking with my mentor, Dr. Avik Biyani, recently. I was telling him about the African Study Bible, which I came across with this research. I've never heard of the African Study Bible before. And it's a very brilliant resource, which I enjoy. But I was joking with him that I actually came across that resource surfing through an American theologian's website.
Right.
So it was an accidental discovery for me. I would have expected that such a resource would, be publicized and marketed more in a way that the kind of people that need it would readily find. So the accessibility aspect of that work would also be something that I would hope that organizations like yours would look into, to get these resources to the hands of those that need it, especially people of my generation that might not even have a clue because we are busy reading some Western materials. So yeah.
Yeah, well, that brings us on to another subject that you raised, and that is that the influential authors on millennial African Christians were almost all Westerners. Now,
yeah.
I would argue, given that Africa is the continent with the most Christians, and as you've said, a young population, the future of the church worldwide is in Africa. I'd argue that all of us should be reading African authors.
We should.
And yet young African Christians are reading Westerners. What do you think can be done to address this?
To address it is first to identify what's causing that, the skewed or the imbalance in this sense. I think that, and this is me just speaking as a millennial myself, as someone that attempted to publish a few books both in Nigeria and now that I'm in the UK. On the one hand, there is the issue of quality of published materials, especially. I know things are getting better now, but some 10, 20 years ago, it's often that the case would be that if you go into a Christian bookshop and you want to buy a book, you see all the Western authored books looking attractive in terms of the way they are published and the packaging and everything. And then maybe you move over to some supposed renowned Nigerian authors section, and you don't even like from the, let alone the content. There's already a kind of dissonance because I mean, who wants quality materials? And so there is that part, as small as that can be. But besides that, especially when we get into the academia, the fact remains that many Africans are not writing or publishing. In lots of researches that have been done both in the diaspora and on the continent that just end up in a library or in some office locked up, and that's the end of it. So we actually need to start writing, start publishing, start doing it. Part of what I've been, by God's grace, open to be more intentional about is I've seen this gap of, I want resources that can speak to me as a young that is a Christian and an African, but I'm not exactly finding them. At least the ones that can speak my language, if you get what I mean. And so I'm beginning to plug in that gap by contributing my own quota and in books and trying to come across as African as I can, and like that. So the kind of resources I would have loved to engage with, I'm not seeing. I'm intentional about wanting to begin to make that contribution myself. The same thing with the podcast space. I listen to podcasts a lot, same thing with my wife. But it's occurred to us like over a year ago that we don't exactly have any of these podcast platforms that we're listening in from that speaks to our realities as a Christian and an African and a young person. And so we start something in that regard. And both of us together started Omoluabi Podcast, which is just where we take one Yoruba proverb at a time and unpack it from a biblical perspective. Just trying to make the young listeners know that there is this vast resource of godly wisdom that is locked up in our everyday sayings and that are not in any way contradictory to the scriptures in that sense. So that's a resource we thought we would have loved to engage with, but now we are beginning to plug in that space. So yeah, that's where to start from. Let's start filling the gaps wherever we recognize them and by the graces and gifts that God has given each and every one of us. And then let's leverage on platforms and resources, publishing firms now that are pro-African in a sense, that they are intentional about publishing books by Africans for the African market space, like the NP in Kenya, and so many other publishers like that. Let's leverage such platforms and resources to gap.
Well, I will link to your page on Amazon and also to your podcast, because as I say, I don't think it's just young African Christians who need to be learning from Africans, but Westerners do too. We all need each other.
Absolutely.
And just apart from your own attempts to plug that gap, who are some African authors that you would really recommend, people who've blessed you?
Especially in my just concluded master's degree, I've had to wrestle a lot with the works of Mbiti, John S. Mbiti, Ediako, and Agbon Orobato. Those three have influenced and kind of further awakened my desire to engage in the research in and of itself. But in the general Christian ministry space, if you will, I love books that are written by Reverend Olushola Areogun. It's based somewhere in Togo, in the southwest of Nigeria as well. In the likes of Daddy Gio, as is popularly known, Pastor Adeboye of the Redeemed Christian Church of God. Yeah, I think those would be some 5-ish academic and non-academic African authors that I know that I've gleaned from their resources extensively. Yeah.
Well, again, I'll provide some links so that people can research into that.
All right.
Pastor Joseph, thank you very, very much. It's been
thank you, Eddie.
Fascinating to listen and to learn from you. But just before we go, there are a few questions I like to ask everyone.
All right.
The first is that if you had 2 minutes to speak to the leadership of the evangelical church in the UK, the British church, what would you wish to say to them?
That's a very interesting question, and one that I should have taken 20 years to think about before the 2 minutes. But of course, there is this need for learning, unlearning, and relearning for us. That's, I mean, when you say that leaders of the church in the UK, I would imagine that involves both the British indigenous leaders and of course, even the migrants, the leaders of the migrant congregation. And from both sides of the divide, so to speak, and there shouldn't be a divide, but from both sides of that line, we need to unlearn some things. We need to relearn some things. There is a proverb where I come from that says, I would say it in English, basically, just to kind of paraphrase it, that when a stranger insists on staying for 5 days, even after the host has made it clear that they are in hunger, they are suffering, they don't have enough, and yet as a stranger, you insist on staying for 5 days, there must be something about such a stranger. It's either the stranger has something to ameliorate the hunger or the poverty, as the case may be, or that stranger is totally insensitive. So basically, I'm bringing that in from the perspective of the fact that migrant churches in the UK is a reality that has come to stay.
Yeah, absolutely.
And they are coming and growing in the same space and context in which many indigenous churches are dying of. It's like saying the hosts are in hunger, they are in poverty, like that proverb allude. But these strangers that are insisting on staying not just for 5 days, but for 5 days and counting, it's probably because God has deposited something in us that can help to ameliorate that hunger, that poverty, that can slow down that decline, that can bring some sort of vitality. But of course, again, there are proverbs where I come from that would warn the stranger to know that whenever you're in a new territory, you need to tread gently. You need to tread carefully. You need to take your time to learn, to unlearn, and to relearn before you begin to engage in certain ways. So we need those kind of cross-cultural learning, which will come by listening to one another and just being intentionally about making friends with one another and then building God's kingdom together. So that would be, maybe I've spoken for more than 2 minutes, but that's about what I would say in 2 minutes.
we weren't timing it, it's okay. And then just to get to know a little bit more about you as a person, could you tell us your favorite piece of music? if you want to choose a piece of Christian music and a piece of secular music, I'll let you have two. But
thank you. My favorite piece of Christian music would be anything that is done by Tope Alabi, and that might be a name that many of your listeners would be hearing for the first time.
yeah,
But she's a Nigerian Yoruba woman that is a Christian gospel singer. That's the title then go by, or job description, gospel singers. But she's the best I've seen so far in taking the indigenous language of the Yorubas and a Christian faith as a Pentecostal Christian and articulating the worship of God in songs in a way that is ever so brilliant. And so I love anything that she does. From a secular point of view.
Can you find some of her work on YouTube?
Absolutely, lots of our works on YouTube, and with millions of views. So she's actually popular within our own circle, of course.
Excellent. I'll put some links to her music.
All right. But from the secular point of view, it would be King Sunny Ade. That's a legendary musician in Nigeria, but not from a Christian sense. Just the brilliance and yeah, because my dad also, I grew up listening to his music because my dad listens with him. So yeah, those would be two musicians or music figure that I still go back to once in a while. Yeah.
Excellent. And then favorite book. And again, if you need two, you can have two.
I think for favorite book, I will just stick with one. And this time is actually not an African. It Still Moves Stones by Max Lucado. And that's probably just because Lucado is my favorite author. I think he has influenced the way I write more than any other writer. And It Still Moves Stones was the book that introduced me to him. And so ever since I read that, I've read almost any other thing that he has written in terms of published books. But yeah, I love anything from Max Lucado. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Pastor Joseph, thank you very, very much. It's been an encouragement to talk to you, and your research is fascinating, and I'm very grateful that you've done it and that you've been willing to share it.
Thank you, Eddie. Thanks for giving me the opportunity and the platform to also give expression to some of these things on a different platform and broadening the reach of it. Thank you.
Oh, you're more than welcome. The Lord bless you.
Amen. I need to.